Why is it
life. I saw a man, he danced with his wife in Chicago. Chicago, my hometown. Chicago.
That was a fun video. Hello, hi, we are live. It's gonna be a minute before anyone joins. Anyways, but this is our new weekly series, Chicago Style Party Crashers on Chicago. I need to turn on Do Not Disturb because all of a sudden I'm getting tons of texts, and I hope that there's no emergency. Sorry in advance, everyone. I'm sure you can figure it out without me. Okay, Andrew, let's give like a little recap on why you're going to be the Chicago guy. I'll give a recap on myself in case people don't know, but I'm Megan. I'm everywhere doing random things all the time. But I started working with Andrew for doing some anti-BDS organizing, anti-BDS repeal organizing, and Andrew's worked in Chicago politics for a while, so he's kind of become my go-to to ask questions on like what is going on, because I have found that it is very hard to figure out what is actually going on in Chicago, and understanding like the landscape and how history has really shaped and framed current politics. So then I figured, why not just bring Andrew on regularly so people can learn along with me? But if you want to go ahead and give more of an intro.
Yeah, absolutely. Really excited to be here, and it was amazing to see your work on the anti-BDS repeal, and just kind of how much your audience is engaged with I think wanting to understand the civic process and kind of what's going on behind the scenes. And so, a little bit about me is, I've been organizing in Chicago. I was looking back, and I started my first organizing campaign was in 2008. So I'm getting uncomfortably close to 20 years of organizing in Chicago. And that whole time it's been, primarily exclusively focused on the needs of working families. But it's been everything from housing to environment to immigration to labor. And over the past 5 years, or 6 years now, we've been working as Herrera Strategy that my wife and I founded to advance public policy goals for working families. Um, and yeah, so just have been very engaged here for a long time, and I'm one of those people. There's a lot of folks out there who are very interested in, I think I'd consider like the oral history of politics and of the spaces that we occupy. And I think that the story of Chicago politics is really the story of working people. And it's less about the money here than it is in other places, and it's more about the organizing, and it always has been. And I think that the rest of the country, and in fact much of the world, has learned a lot from Chicago organizing over the past century, and we still have a lot more to give, I think, and to provide for the rest of the country. And so just thinking about and talking about Chicago politics in a way that I think makes it accessible, like the history of it, which could be a drama, could be several dramas, and then also thinking about how does understanding Chicago politics help us understand the current moment is something I'm really interested in exploring here.
Yeah. Well, so on that, on like understanding the current moment, you had said like politics is gangster, and that's why it's really good to get into Chicago politics. And as as I've been digging into Chicago politics, it definitely there is a lot of Trumpyism to the way power moves and the way people move in politics. I mean, you have like, yeah, Trump basically acts as a mob boss here in the States. And you see this like cultural thing play out. I think it's really hard to extract that kind of culture from politics, but really especially in Chicago, like how that same culture is moving into all different spaces from right to left. The same like mob boss culture, which I found really fascinating. And also thinking like, in terms of fighting the Trump administration and the whole right wing, we can't just fight it and recreate a left wing that is also a gangster left wing that doesn't really ultimately build a true populist movement. And so, like, I think putting Chicago kind of under a microscope to see how these different things play out and how we can learn from Chicago as we continue to try to build like a better world of politics, kind of going in blind because America all across the board is still an experiment. We're all like learning as we go, but I think Chicago gives like a little puts it under a microscope. So if you want to like talk more about your idea of politics being gangster in Chicago, love to hear more on that.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things I say about Trump is that one of the gifts that Trump has given us is that he's really pulled back the veil on politics, and there's all this performative stuff that gets layered on top. That there's these norms that won't be violated, and there's just a certain way that things are done, and there's rules you have to understand before you can engage. And Trump took a sledgehammer to all of that, and he says, no, the only thing that matters is power. And I think for the purposes of political understanding, the definition of power that's useful is power is the ability to organize people and organize resources to get things done, right? And it could be building a skyscraper like Trump has done throughout his career, or it could be building a social safety net, or whatever else it is, building a public school system. And in Chicago, it's always been a little bit clearer, that undercurrent. Like, people play in the undercurrents of power, and they understand power. The political actors here understand power a little more acutely. And even down to the neighborhood level, folks understand who has power, who they need to orient toward, to be able to keep the lights on their block, to be able to keep the garbage picked up, to be able to keep the sewer running, and to make sure that they get city services that they need beyond that. And so I think that's where, it's a useful place to start. And I think for a lot of places in the country, and particularly the more privileged places, that this is a new idea that politics is all about power. There's this feeling that it should be about decency. It should be about something more, but it is just about power. And there's other things that factor into, like, how can you organize people, and people have their own personal senses of decency and communal senses of decency. And those are things that place limits on power. And what Trump has done is blown through all of those limits. And so if you think about Chicago being gangster, you think about, the Chicago political machine, right? It's the first place to start, and the word gets thrown around a lot. I remember, when Chewy was running for mayor, a lot of the publications were framing it as, this machine versus that machine. It's like the Chewy machine versus, I forget what other machines they were talking about, the CTU machine and this other machine, whatever. But what the machine really refers to is a style of politics that was really common in the 19th century, particularly in basically every big city across the planet, where political access was conditioned on political favor, right? Sorry, access to public resources was conditioned on political favor, and the currency was voter turnout. So basically, as like democracy took hold in a lot of places, people very quickly figured out that a vote had a monetary value to it, and you could hold it over somebody's head. And so there's stories. It's not, I haven't heard of this happening anytime in the past few decades, but it used to be really common that if you didn't show up and vote on election day, and this is like before mail-in voting was common and all that. So if you didn't show up on election day, it could be that you would show up the next garbage pickup day, and instead of picking up the garbage would be strewn all over your yard, right? And so it's not that people are going out and breaking your knees or whatever, but like, maybe you lose your job. Maybe your cousin loses his job because you didn't show up to vote. And if you were a precinct captain, and you got, certain kind of privileges, and you could get your cousin a job. But then if you also didn't get the voter turnout numbers that you had committed to, then you're not just your one cousin, but like your whole family and your street, and everybody loses their jobs because they all had, not jobs that anybody's becoming a millionaire off of, although some people did become millionaires. But for the most part, these are jobs that kind of fulfilled the American dream, the promise of like the working man being able to do a 9 to 5 and provide a better life for their kids. And the problem with this, and the reason that it went away, is because in the wave of austerity that happened, there were a few austerity waves that happened, but the big one in the US started in the 70s. And so you see like this debt crisis happen all over the place. And so all of a sudden there's no more money. And when the money runs out, then all of a sudden there's no more jobs. When the jobs run out, there's no reason to be loyal to the machine, and the machine falls apart. And so most of these bureaucracies reform themselves. But Chicago actually kept its way through all the way to the 2000s, until Mayor Daley decided not to run. Rahm Emanuel took over and implemented a wave of like really severe neoliberal austerity cuts to the Chicago budget, which famously ended in the closure of there's like over 50 CPS schools. And that's still something that's kind of reverberating in the city and led to kind of the militancy in CTU and all kinds of things. So, sorry, I'm kind of getting a little wonky with this. I'm going to say a few highlights here, right?
Mhm.
Anton Cermak, who was the founder of the Chicago Machine.
Mhm.
Anton Cermak was
Do you want to
actually
explain like what you mean by the Chicago Machine for anyone who
yeah.
doesn't?
So Anton Cermak was the one who understood this. So Anton Cermak, what he did was, and stop me from getting too professorial here, but what was really interesting is that the Irish had really kind of dominated Chicago politics in the late 19th century into the 20th century. Um, and then Anton Cermak put together a coalition of Czechs, like Bohemians, they called them at the time, because like Czechoslovakian, whatever. Um, Bohemians, Jews, Poles, Germans. So a bunch of like meaningful ethnic minorities in the city. And he took over the Cook County Democratic Party. And from his perch in the Cook County Democratic Party, he was able to move a lot of jobs around. And he built a patronage system. And so that patronage system what actually propelled him to the mayorship. So he became mayor of the city of Chicago. And then in 1932, I believe, maybe 31, he was assassinated. Um, but while he was kind of by accident, right? Because he was standing next to FDR.
Mhm.
And he apparently had gone to Miami to apologize to FDR, like to make nice with FDR, because he had held down Illinois with his patronage machine to vote against FDR. Um, and so he was going to make nice and get federal dollars to help bring that money into Chicago to oil the machine because there was a financial crisis in the city at the time. We're talking about the early days of the Great Depression. And he needed more patronage jobs to be able to make things work. So he just so happened to be standing next to FDR. Somebody takes a shot at FDR, hits Cermak, and Cermak dies a couple weeks later, which sent shockwaves through Chicago, and then ended up power kind of reverted back to the Irish, and the Irish were able to take over the political machine that Cermak had built, and that kind of became the machine that was the patronage machine. Again, going back to that existed that was the dominant political structure in Chicago all the way through when did Rom win? 2009? Um, no, 2007, Rom won. Um, and so all the way until then. And there's still pockets of it that exist down in the 13th ward, the 15th ward, the 10th ward to an extent, um, and some others. And so that like you're looking at that and you're just like, this is a machine that's kind of apolitical. It doesn't have a real ideological tilt. What it is concerned with is city services. What it's concerned with is meeting the most basic needs of the constituents of the machine and making sure that it's creating a financial incentive for people to continue participating in the machine. And by doing so, what you're able to do, you look at the turnout in a municipal race and you're looking at like 35% um, generally. And so if you can control 60%, like lockdown, but like they're going to turn out, they're going to vote for you. That means that you can basically guarantee the results of any election, any municipal election with like 18% of the vote. And so at that point, it's not about having enough for everybody. It's about taking the whole pie that's meant for everybody and kind of lavishing it on a pretty small segment. And then also making sure that the people with really serious money, the big corporations and whatnot, are not interfering too much. Um, and so it's maintaining that balance. And the obvious problem with that is that there's a lot of people that get cut out.
Mhm.
And so you see, oh, and I forgot to mention that Anton Cermak was organizing a lot with the Black community. Um, and
What does that, sorry to interrupt, but like the 18%, do you see that concentrated over like certain populations, or where is that 18%
yeah, so
most
so that's
concentrated, would you say?
no, that's a great question, and that's you kind of read my mind because so the problem is if you are a minority that is not big enough to like force your way into the room, and you're not part of that 18% that's already got to like getting taken care of somehow, you basically get nothing, right? You
Mhm.
like don't exist. And and so that's what happened. Like Cermak started bringing in this kind of rainbow coalition, if you will, like the early 20th
Mhm.
century equivalent of that. And then um, and then he dies, that coalition falls apart, and it's supplanted by the Irish, which have been the dominant political power before and after. Um, and then you see kind of a backsliding in particularly black political, not participation, but representation. And so, like, to answer your question, like to fast forward to today's world when we were running elections campaigns against Burke in the 14th Ward, an election that ultimately Alderwoman Helu Gutierrez won, but took us a few tries. Um, you would see the voter participation numbers are crazy. I don't have the actual percentages in front of me,
Yeah, I can
but if
look
you
it up.
look it up, well, it might be a little hard to find, but because if you look at there's like two or three precincts on the west side of the ward, which they got drawn in, so they were white ethnic communities, and most of them were patronage jobs, so they had like city jobs somehow, and those people turned out in huge numbers, and so those few precincts outweighed all of the Latino precincts.
Mhm.
Um, and so you have a majority Latino ward that had been a majority Latino ward for a generation at that point, but still a handful of white precincts were the ones that really kind of determined who the alderman was going to be. And why? Because there was so much political organization in those spaces. And why do they have so much political organization? Because they had a carrot and a stick. You got a really good job, you got a pension, you got all these things. And at the same time, if you don't show up and don't do the thing, you're going to lose that. Um, and it worked. That system worked, and that's how you have like minoritarian rule. And what's really interesting about this now is that you actually have the same thing happening nationally, right? This is like what do they call it? Um, the like caring conservatism or something like that, compassionate conservatism. But what they don't say, like what's between the lines, is that it's compassionate conservatism for white people, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and so, you see like, oh, we've liberalized immigration policy for white South Africans, right? Everybody else gets fucked. But white South Africans, they've never had a better day for
Literally,
immigration.
only white South Africans have gotten green
Yeah.
cards this year because
Yeah.
they are apparently being genocided, which is like absolutely insane.
Like
Like,
somebody said something mean to a farmer one time. Uh, and I mean, even though white South Africans say they're not being genocided, like there's just, it's bonkers. But the thing is, and again, you go back to this logic, how do you take care of the corporate elite who have the power to like blow things up? And uh, enough of the electorate that you guarantee a path through the primary at least, right?
mhm.
And so if you're Donald Trump, that's not a very big number of people. Like you need to control 30% base. And to like really maintain that 30% base, you really need to take care of like 20% of people, right? And have them be like fanatical for you. And so if you take the trillions of dollars the federal government has and you direct it towards those people, then you at least are guaranteeing your way through the Republican primary, right? And that basically has been the it's the same basic logic of any patronage machine. And it's not surprising that Trump grew up in like patronage New York, right? Like that's where his dad made all his money. And so
Mhm.
like this is a system that he understood very well, and he understood, how do you it's not corruption per se in the sense of like I'm paying you to like I'm paying for votes directly, but it is a system that really kind of works well with corruption, right?
Mhm.
Because the big question that a precinct captain has, that a ward, an alderman has, that a committee person has, is how do I get the most resources for my voters in my ward to make sure that I'm maximizing voter turnout in my ward?
Mhm.
And the answer, I mean, there's a few different answers to that, but like, that's when do I have federal dollars coming in? Okay, we're going to put those there. Do I have a corporation that's going to, move some jobs around and, we make sure they move them to my area? Um, and it's kind of with these blinders on that you're not actually looking for what makes sense for everybody. What makes sense down the line. You're looking for the next cycle, and you're looking for how am I going to take care of my voters right now? And and when you're only thinking in 2 year or 4 year cycles, and you've got a corporation that's able to think in 30 year time
Mhm.
frames, then we're always going to lose, right? And
Mhm.
and that's ultimately kind of what's happened with Chicago. And you look at the Chicago parking meter deal or Meigs Field, right? Both of these things were gangster moves by the mayor, um, who bulldozed Meigs Field in the middle of the night and then told the council about it the next day. Um, or he did the parking meter deal and sold off basically all of Chicago's rights to its own streets for like 75 years. I think it's 77 years, basically two or three generations,
Wow.
for like $1 billion that they've already made back, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so you look at all
And
of
it's like,
that.
but why?
Well, why?
Well,
But the why is
yeah.
very clear. And the why was because he needed to pay off all the contracts that he had to get through that
Hmm.
year's budget. And that's
Hmm.
exactly the thing, is like the logic of us,
Just like reactive. Yeah.
he's like a mob boss who needed a cash infusion to pay all his fucking guys and to keep everybody happy so nobody was going to turn on him just long enough for him to get out of office. And
Hmm.
and that's the problem with these patronage systems, is that they create a shortcut around accountability. And
Hmm.
so, it's not like the whole community coming in. And that's where, another big thing that we talk about in Chicago is TIFs, the tax incremental financing. And so that's kind of a doozy to explain to folks who aren't already familiar with it. But the basic idea is that you create a district and you say, okay, this is going to be a 5-year TIF. And if the tax levy there, the property tax levy is $100,000 in year one and $500,000 in year five, there's a $400,000 difference between the one and five, and that $400,000 goes into a special fund, right? And then that special
Hmm.
fund gets to be used on community development projects, right, that are in the public interest. But then the city will go around and they'll say, okay, so that's money that's being taken out of the property tax pool, which is money that the property taxes pay for our streets, our schools, our cops, or
Hmm.
whatever. And so obviously, if you're not paying into it, you've got to raise taxes to be able to have the same amount of money because you've taken out a bucket of money. So you've got to raise money to be able to pay the teachers and be able to pay whatever you need to pay. And so what that does is make sure that you're not having a communal decision. It's not the city talking about, where we should be investing our resources. That power now goes to an alderman. And then that individual alderman gets to decide, well, what's the best for me politically? And
Hmm.
that tends to be, and that has tended to be, or at least in very many cases, it has been a target, right? They built a target in Uptown with TIF money. They built a target in McKinley Park with TIF money. That was the former 25th Ward Alderman, Danny Solis, who okayed the McKinley Park one, and almost certainly they drew his ward to include that one sliver of McKinley Park that had the target there, just so that he could be the one that delivered them the TIF money. And so, and he had a TIF that rehabbed Sears Tower, like probably the most expensive real estate in the city. All of these things is a way to keep special interests happy. And sometimes it's about keeping the neighbors happy. Danny Solis also used a TIF to tear down a crumbling annex to a elementary school and build a soccer field or a basketball court there. That's an appropriate use of a TIF.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a report that just came out that over the past 40 years, TIFs have dramatically increased taxes and have not actually increased services or like driven benefits or economic development to particularly working communities. And it's actually worked for the Loop, but it hasn't worked for the working communities. So looking shocker there.
Hmm.
Um, and that really is kind of the end result of this patronage politics, is everybody wants a piece of the pie, but then if you're not politically plugged in, which most people are not politically plugged in, then you'll get left out, right? And then where like another place where Chicago uh is gangster. I gotta look at my notes real quick here, make sure I get this right. Um,
So
well, a
when
few
you
things.
say
Sorry, go
when you
ahead.
say it's gangster though, I mean like gangster in the way that like dope, and also gangster in a way that like kind of there's a body count. There's like it means it in like all sorts of ways. It just really runs like a full gang. Um
So let me give you the biggest one, and the reason that
yeah.
I always think like you think gangs, Chicago, you think of like black and Latino kids like on the streets and gangbangers and whatever, like whatever the national media narrative is, whatever Donald Trump is saying. But when I think
Hmm.
about Chicago being gangster, I think about the Hamburg Athletic Club, right? which was what Richard J. Daley. He came up through the Hamburg Athletic Club, which was nominally a Bridgeport youth sports club, but functionally it was a Chicago street gang, and they were implicated in the 1919 race riots, right? So like, and Richard J. Daley. So now, folks who don't know, the 1919 race riots are something that weirdly got popularized by in like the popular imagination by gosh, what was that show? Watchmen, the TV
Oh,
serialization
yeah.
of Watchmen.
Hmm.
Um, and it's kind of like one of those like missing pieces of history that everyone like became aware of after George Floyd. Um, but basically you had the black soldiers coming back from World War One, and the the white bosses kind of became very nervous that all of a sudden you've got this military trained kind of cadre of black leaders who can defend themselves. And then you had like Black Wall Street and like a bunch of different places they started popping up. And so what must have been coordinated because it all happened at the same time in the summer of 1919 all across the country, all of the spine of these black communities was burned down everywhere.
Hmm.
And in 1919 in Chicago, it started with, well, supposedly, the reason was a young black boy floated
Was swimming. He
across
like
the
crossed
invisible
the
line.
imaginary line. Yeah.
Yeah, and was stoned to death on the beach.
Hmm.
Um, and then the black GIs, the veterans, responded and defended
Hmm.
their community, and then
As
they
they
were
should.
viciously put down, as is everyone's right.
Hmm.
And they were viciously put down by the kind of Irish political elite. And the fact that Richard J. Daley, kind of the progenitor or whatever of the Daley clan and the one who kind of really kind of held Chicago by the balls for half a century or more, was actually an inciting actor in that through this Hamburg Athletic Club.
I
Um,
didn't know that part of the story.
yeah,
That's
and
interesting.
so he was literally a gangster. And then after Anton Cermak died, or was assassinated, or however you want to talk about that, um, they so the Hamburg network muscled its way into the 11th Ward Democratic Organization like through the 30s, and they did it in a gangster way. Like they muscled their way in. They were super aggressive, but sometimes also violent. Like they were not above like kicking the shit out of people, and so they just took over the entire Democratic machine in that area. Um, and so that's in Bridgeport, which is kind of like a just like straight south kind of. It's like right by the 94, which kind of bisects the east and west in Chicago. Um, and so the that was Bridgeport, and then Cermak was from Lawndale, which is I'm in Pilsen, and that's just a little bit west of us. So these are like neighboring all Southsiders, and so you've got Cermak goes and does his thing, and then that his death and the disorganization that caused in his coalition coincided with by the 30s, the Hamburg Athletic Club and the Dailies had really kind of muscled their way into the scene, and so they proceeded over the next 2 decades to really just take over the Democratic Party. And that's where what I call him Old Man Daley, Richard J. Daley, took over the city completely. And then they held it until I forget when he stepped down. It was like 76, I think. But he held it for like 30 years, and then his son held it for almost another 30 years. Um, and so like there is no more gangster beginning than that. And then the other thing that's interesting, and look, I have a lot of respect for the machine. It's like uh, I respect game, right? And these
Hmm.
guys, they were very good at what they did, and they don't so much exist anymore. But I think there's a lot of lessons the left should learn from how they operated, and I think in terms of organizing style and tactics, you see like competent organizers like New York DSA actually borrowing a lot from what the Chicago Machine was able to do. And the big thing was like gangster, like I'm talking about, like, well, I'm not saying DSA is doing this, so separate that. But the like gangster I was talking about, like you don't show up to the polling place on election day and they throw trash all over your yard, right, to send a symbol, to send a message. I also know that I heard from an operative that back in the Madigan days, so um, Michael Madigan became like the head of the state party, and he came through the same system. So it was a little bit later. Um, and he's the longest serving speaker in U.S. history, longest serving state speaker in U.S. history. Um, and so there are incidents where like he brought somebody, there was a party candidate. She was an elected official already. She was told not to give money to a certain somebody, just another candidate, and it's kind of a routine thing. Candidates will give each other $500 here and there because they've got their political accounts and they're all just kind of moving money around as they go to each other's fundraisers. So she was told not to do it. She was kind of a space cadet, apparently, and like missed the message and did it. And then she showed up to her office the next day and all everything was gone. There was no chairs, there was no desks, there was no lights, there was like completely spotless, empty office. And as soon as she walked in, she got a call, and the call said, "Don't ever fucking disrespect us again."
Oh my
And they hung
God.
up. And then she left, and the next day all the stuff was back, and nobody ever talked about it. And that's like in the past 10 years, right?
Wow.
So like this is what I mean by like gangster, right? And like extremely cutthroat. Um, and people also forget about like the mob is like in the places where the mob is really powerful, they also deliver services. And that's at the core part of their promise. And so, I also think that kind of I'm sure I'm not alone in this theory, but my theory of it is like, so if you kind of put yourself back in time, Hamburg Athletic Club, 1919, like whatever, Daly comes in the 50s. And he's the guy who's presiding over, ruling the city and truly like at the peak of his power during the civil rights movement. Um, and so, it's in Bridgeport, their neighborhood, where there was I think it was ACLU, but there was a test case where a black couple moved into a Bridgeport block. It's like a white couple rented it, and the black couple is the one that showed up to actually live there. And like the neighborhood was going to burn down about it. Like everyone was completely losing their minds. Um, and so, you have those dynamics, and then you have like Fred Hampton come up, right, in the Black Panthers,
Right.
and these
I
guys
was going
are
to bring
doing
that up too. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And so, what are they doing?
Breakfast, community
Breakfast, exactly,
defense. Yeah.
exactly. And so
Yeah.
they're doing all the stuff that's
Teaching
like,
people to
hey, they're
read.
filling a social need.
Hmm.
And so what happens? They fucking kill him, right? And that was like, I mean, it was the FBI that was running stuff, but it was CPD that wanted him dead. And and so you see the same kind of pattern of behavior. And one of the most dangerous things about Fred Hampton, as far as the white establishment was concerned, is that he was doing what Anton Cermak had done, 50 years before that, which is that he was actively organizing with the Young Lords, so a Latino street gang of youth, and he actually also started actively working. He's dispatched white people from the South Side who were organizing with them to organize with the kind of
Young
white ethnics
Patriots.
that were living on the North Side in Uptown. And so you had all of a sudden this like
Which
street
I
gang
think
led rainbow coalition.
important to note, because I think this is their symbol, their emblem was a Confederate flag, and he still organized with them. And he did get some people like, they're like, no, we're not doing that, like in the Young Lords and in some of the Panthers, and even the Young Patriots were like, we don't know about like these gangbangers. But then when he went up to a local bar and delivered them a speech, and the police like beat him up outside the bar afterwards, they realized like they were like, oh, he's with us. And like it just changed this whole like dynamic where they realize like once they're in the same spaces, they'll have the same oppressor, they have the same people coming up after them. And that is like, I mean, like now if somebody has a Confederate flag, nobody on the left is trying to organize with them, rightfully so. And also like that was insane. Like he was just knew what he had to do, which I find like mad respect. We should all get our inner Fred Hampton.
I totally agree, and I think that ability to not just put differences aside but organize across differences is an extremely rare talent. He was so young too. People forget. He was like, how old was he? He was like 23 when he died.
He was 20, yeah, 21, 23 when he died, somewhere.
That's crazy. And like he accomplished so much and he was so electric. And I mean, I think that movie that came out, Judas and the Black Messiah, um, was such a disappointment because like it completely missed all of the like the mechanic. It made it a personal drama, like, oh, electric young leader betrayed by friend. But like it's the machinery of Chicago that makes it interesting, and how the machinery depends on people being divided. And
Totally.
so like you got to be able to take care of this one group. And it's like, you look at like Assad in Syria, right? And what are they called? The Alawites. I hate to get that too wrong, but his kind of ethnic minority in Syria, he had them hook, line, and sinker because they felt that if he fell, there was going to be a genocide against them because Assad had committed so many crimes against humanity against everybody else in Syria. Um, and so like, and it's something that strongmen use all over the world, where it's like you not only, but by dividing people and privileging one group over another, this is the same thing that happened in Rwanda, the Belgian setup. Like you privilege a minority over the majority, and the minority both is privileged, so they want to give the privileges, and also they know the majority is being wronged. And so they're actually afraid of losing power because if they lose power, they're afraid that, people are going to come after them and there's going to be retribution. Um, and so there's a lot of those dynamics that are also at play, where you see like how Chicago was able to avoid white flight to the extent that it did. Like some neighborhoods got decimated by it and others did not. Um, and and basically it was by like targeting resources at specific communities and making sure that they were also like for a long time, Black people were only allowed to live in one ward in Chicago, right? um, which also happened to be like the Jewish ward, Lawndale, which also happened to be the ward that Anton Cermak organized in, and he built his coalition through. And it also is the ward that Ben Lewis took over. And then I think like 2 days after he was elected, after he won re-election, so he kind of came in as like a machine guy, right? And there was the black wards. You had to have a black alderman, and so they would allow a black person to be alderman, but then that black alderman had to come like salute
Staying in
and
line. Yeah.
yeah. And so he won re-election, and he's like, you know what? Fuck y'all. I'm gonna represent my people. And 2 days later, they found him shot dead in his office, handcuffed to his chair. And then
Oh my
CPD was
God.
like, we can't figure out who did it. Handcuffed. Like, how many people fucking handcuff
Sure,
you to a chair and shoot you?
sure they did it. That's why
I'm
they
sure it was
can't
like
figure out who did
CPD
it.
issued handcuffs. You know, couldn't
Yeah.
trace them.
Yeah.
And so, once again, fucking gangster. Like, this is a city that, Cermak was killed. Harrison was killed in the 1890s, right after the 2 days before the World Fair ended, actually. Cermak's killed in 31, and there's a bunch of conspiracy theories that Cermak was actually whacked by the mob because he was kind of like moving in on the turf or whatever. Um, I guess most historians dismiss that as a fantasy. But like, there's that level of conspiracy thinking in Chicago for good reason. And then
Mhm.
Ben Lewis killed in 63 and 68, King is killed, and then you have all of the riots in Chicago, and the Mayor Daley issues a shoot to kill order for any arsonists, um, which is fucking wild. And then in
Yeah.
69, you've got Fred Hampton killed in the street in Chicago. And then when Latinos start coming out politically, so we were totally disenfranchised. And then through the 80s and 90s, because of like federal policy, there was a huge influx of Mexican immigration. And so we see our numbers grow here in Chicago. Um, and we were able to like force ourselves into the scene in a way that we had not previously been able to do. Um, and that's when you see Rudy Lozano Jr. assassinated, right? And I believe that was 83. Um, and he would have become the first Latino alderman if he hadn't been assassinated. And so, and showing how everything's connected, Rudy's sister, Emma Lozano, who's now running for the school board, her 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 husband, who's I don't know how to talk about it. May he rest in peace, Reverend Slim Coleman. He was actually the one who had been dispatched by Fred Hampton to go talk to the white folks on the north side because he was a white guy.
Oh, wow.
So like everything's hella connected, right?
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and so yeah, it's just when I say politics is gangster here, is like you look at any period of transition in Chicago politics, and it's accompanied by like actual murder. In the murder that kind of like reminds you of like gang turf wars.
Mhm.
Um, and then beyond that, you see like people just being extremely aggressive, and it's still kind of like built into the DNA here, which is like if you come at power, they're going to defame you, they're going to attack you, they're going to do all these kinds of things. Um, and meanwhile, we have had a long history of politicians here who have like been the ultimate skis bags. Like, our former state rep Eddie Acevedo, went to prison, and the he would threaten people with kind of assaulting them if for random policy disagreements, or like he felt offended by things and he kind of carried himself that way. Tony, uh, yeah, Tony Munoz, not Munoz. I'm sorry, Tony, not throw you in there. Um, Marty Sandoval. Marty Sandoval also was a state senator. He was almost certainly going to go to prison, but he died during the pandemic. So RIP. But he also would have like a golf outing where he would have like a golden Tommy gun that you would take shots of tequila out of. It was like a famous golf outing, and then
These people
he
are
kind
like caricatures. Like,
no,
I'm thinking
truly,
like Blago too. I'm like
yeah,
remembering
Blago.
all of that. Like it's just, I feel like it's a nonstop. Like, but taking one person down does nothing to the machine. It's just like replacing a cog in a
Right.
machine,
Well, and
right?
yeah, and Blago, like he married Dick Mel's daughter, right, as his way into the machine. Because Chicago's famous for like, don't send nobody, nobody sent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so you kind of had to be somebody before you could like run in those circles. And I think that's still true to an extent. There's a lot of suspicion here, and a lot of closed circles, and some are more closed than others. And it tends to be the less closed places are the richer places because, like, I think people can kind of like buy their way into politics themselves, and the more working class
They
places
have
tend
the
to be
same
like,
interests, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah.
yeah, they have the same interest. Even if they don't have the same interest, like they have the fucking free time to just like and the money. Like, what do you need? 100K to run an automatic race, really? And so, like, if you live in Lincoln Park, chances are you can raise 100K out of your network, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you live down here in Pilsen, like where or other folks, other places, like you don't raise 100K without unions, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so the network closes a lot more. And not putting unions on blast at all, but there's not that many decision makers in the union world. And so you'll have like one political officer at a union local that's donating to like 50 races or deciding what position they're going to take in 50 races. So just the general dynamics on that is like on workflow is that they're going to go with people they know, and it's going to be pretty hard to kind of like separate them from what the comfortable known is. And so to
Mm-hmm.
run an insurgent politics becomes more difficult in that kind of system. And they rely on, known political entities. So like, who do you know in the system? And that's where people still think that Chicago is a machine because it's like there's like these political networks and these kind of trusted advisors and all that kind of stuff that that really informs a lot of the kind of the political horizons here, the horizons of possibility. But it's not the same as it was where you know you did a couple of years as alderman's chief of staff, or you were the committee person, or you were whatever, and then all of a sudden you get like a nice like $180,000 streets and sanitation job or a park district job, or like the first thing Rom did when he came in to balance the budget was cut the park district in half, and like people almost didn't feel it. You know what I'm saying? And
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of things that I mean, Rom's an austerity guy, and it's hard to stand here and defend that. I'm not going to. Um, at the same time, you're looking at there were a lot of jobs in the city that inarguably existed with no function, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like right now, like there's very few patronage positions left, but like the Cook County Board of Review is a patronage position. They have like
Mm-hmm.
40 staff for each one of those people, and they do very little for most of the year.
Yeah. What
And
what
so
do they do?
I mean, the board of review, its technical function, like it doesn't make a lot of sense that you would have a board of review and an assessor. So like the assessor
Uh-huh.
assesses your property taxes and like the valuation of your property, and then that's
Mm-hmm.
how you get taxed, right? Although people forget that the levy is set by the taxing bodies. So it's not the assessor that actually sets the taxes, it's the taxing body that sets the levy. And then the assessor basically determines what the split is. Like what share of taxes are you going to pay based on your property value and whether it's a corporate, like a business property, or like commercial or residential. Um, the board of review was set up basically as like a way to get money out of property tax attorneys. Um, and so the assessor's office makes a determination, and then the board of review a mechanism for everybody to challenge that. So you could challenge it with the assessor directly, and if the assessor says to get fucked, you can go to the board of review, and the board of review can actually overrule the assessor. And I'm sure I'm missing some fucking nuance in there, but at the end of the day, um, you got what, three board of review members, um, and each of them has 40 staff, is my understanding, and so you like they have a
So it's
lot of
like
staff.
Donald Trump. It is like Donald Trump, where like he's finding jobs for like all of his friends and family, like just making up roles for our tax
Yeah,
dollars to be used. And it's
and so
like,
like
what is this actually doing for anyone?
and that's why you have somebody like Alderman Gardenas who goes and becomes a board of review commissioner because it's a strong patronage role. It's a bigger, it can be seen as a launching point for higher office because you've got your names on a ballot for a much bigger area, and you've got a ton of people who work for you, and all the jobs depend on exclusively you, and none of them are like 100% allocated with their time. So they have a lot of free time, and so you see George had a ton of people out there working on government time, allegedly, um, to do political work for him. And like he ran one of his employees against Theresa Ma for state rep while she was running against him for committee person in the 12th ward. And so you see like there's like I don't want to say echoes, but there's like a residue. There's like a residue of the old political machine left. Um, but as the budgets continue to tighten, as Chicago continues to deal with um, its debt crisis, and we try to avoid austerity, and people are leaning in more and more. I think that we have the opportunity to shift towards a better kind of politics where I don't think we should. I think the lessons that we can learn from patronage is that it's not that like we should be we should be conditioning access to the bureaucracy for the politically connected, and that their primary function should be the continuation of the political system that put them there. Like that's a bad system. But we also should be thinking about, as the left, how do we take power and get ideologically committed people to be in positions of power where they can make decisions. And that way, like when you take over, I actually think the Department of Planning and Development, there's a lot of good things that come out of DPD. Not all good things, I'm sure, but there's a lot of good things and interesting things that come out of DPD. Um, and so it becomes important to get more progressives in DPD who want, high density, who want transit hubs, who want green spaces, who want, livable communities. Like that is something that we should be prioritizing, and making sure that not just the commissioner, but also everybody is, where as many people as possible are having the same kinds of ideas, because people forget it's all about execution. And it's the same with like the Park District. We've got Carlos Rosa over there now. He and I have had our differences in years past, but I couldn't think of a better person that I would want in the Park District, right? Him and Nish Cuevas, who's on his team. They're both very talented people, and they're very committed um, to like working people, working communities being able to live like full, happy lives in their communities. And a big part of that is making sure people have access to high quality outdoor spaces. And so we should be taking power, and we should be putting qualified, competent people who are, share our general ideological vision in these places. Um, and I think though that also the most important thing and the biggest thing to learn from the machine is that there's a political permission structure where if you fulfill the promise of government, then you can do what else you want, right?
Mhm.
And so like you look at Mamdani now, and he's fulfilling the promise of government in ways that people didn't think was possible. And that's why his approval ratings through the freaking roof. Because, there's no better optics than, he keeps winning. He started with the shovels out on a snowy day, and now he's like people are tweeting fucking city
Yeah. They'll
services
be like, look,
requests,
there's a pothole and
and
it'll be filled right like that day,
yeah, like
which is
that day.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like
The
here, like
parents' night out
yeah,
that
the
was
parents'
hosted by
night
the
out.
parks, by the like,
I literally think about that on an almost daily basis. I'm like, please,
yes,
somebody,
like I need
give me a
that.
parents' night out. And you look at all of that, and by contrast, and I know that this is not the point of this episode, but there's too many, including progressive leaders in this city, who, when you point out a problem, castigate you. And they
Mhm.
say, you shouldn't have pointed out that problem. Or how can you say that that problem is mine? It's like, motherfucker, because the buck stops here. Have you heard of that? Like
Mhm.
that's the line. You ran for the job. So that means that the problem is yours now and you've got to fix it. And and so like not all problems are fixable in a day. Not all problems, maybe not all problems are fixable. But the buck stops with the the Chicago's funny because we almost have like dual mayor systems, kind of how I think of it. Like every ward has its own mayor, with like that's how much power the alderman has over the ward. They have a lot of power over zoning, they have a lot of power over permitting, they have a lot of power over a lot of things in their wards. And then those 50 members, then there's 50 wards, and those members kind of are they it's technically a weak mayor system. And so, for folks who are saying we don't have a mayor problem, we've got a city council problem. Sure. But the challenge in Chicago is that Chicago's always had a weak mayor on paper, but because the mayor ran the Democratic Party, he actually told everyone what to do. And so now we have a actually weak mayor for maybe the first time. I would argue Lori Lightfoot was probably the first weak mayor that we've ever had, just in the sense that we had Daley hand the reins to Rahm, and then Rahm had more money than God because he was like the big corporation guy, and a Wall Street guy. And so he was able to make it rain on anybody who he liked, and he could just really fuck with anybody who he didn't like. And so he still had control in that way. Um, but it was different. And then obviously, and then with Lori and now Brandon, you see the council asserting itself in a way that it was previously impossible. And I think the real challenge for City Hall now is that the alderman never had to legislate. The alderman only ever had to worry about voter turnout and constituent services. And now the aldermen also have to legislate because the aldermen just used to do whatever the mayor said. And, with very, very rare exception. And now the aldermen have to do all the constituent services, and also they have to do um, the actual policy making. And that's something that, especially the guys who've been there for a while, like they didn't sign
Mhm.
up for that job. That's not a job that they ever thought they were going to have. And I think that's where you see people like Marty Quinn, who is exceptional at constituent services, exceptional at um, the turnout side of this equation. You see him taking a step back now because the game has changed and he wants to go do something else.
Mhm.
Um, and I think you're going to continue seeing more of that as the nature of politics like continues to change.
Mhm. Yeah. So with like all of that too, where does I'm seeing like a lot with the school budget. I'm seeing a lot with the city budget. There was, like what is up with Chicago's debt crisis? What is up with money and where it's actually being used and how it could be better resourced? Um, you know?
Yeah. I'm looking up real quick. What percent of the Chicago? Um, just pulling up a stat real quick. But so I think the big problem that we have now is like, what is that? I don't know. I struggle to wrap my head around it. So I'm gonna give you my layman's approach because I am a layman. It's just that whatever the reason, right, and whatever the solution, the reality is that, hold on, let me find the actual percentage.
Okay.
Um, 16% of the city budget goes to bond debt service alone. And then if you add in the pension obligations, uh, it's about 40% of the city's operating budget before anything else. And so, like 40, that's freaking huge. So basically, thinking about it in other terms, what that means is that 40% of the money we pay now goes to pay benefits that somebody got yesterday, right?
Okay.
And so we have these debt obligations that were run up largely in like the 80s and 90s, um, where you had these politicians who had completely captured the system, and they've they've they only have to take care of the people in that room, right? And so when you've got the people in that room and you say like, well, what do you want? Like, do you want like us to pay into your pension, or do you want a pay raise? People are like, well, we want the pay raise because that's the short-term benefit. And it didn't matter to the people in the room that there's going to be a really big fucking problem in 30 years because like, well, we'll figure it out then. Um, and and so now we're 30 years later and 30, 40 years later, and we've like the ballooning debt, which was always the plan too. So they not only deferred on the pension payments, but they actually they restructured it, right? And so that, it's kind of like these you can get home loans. Like most people get a home loan that's like the flat, right? So you pay the same amount every month for 30 years. Um, but then there's also the variable interest rate loans. And so you pay like almost nothing for the first 5 years or 10 years. And then you get hit in like year 10 with like a crazy cost increase. And that's actually that's one of the major factors that drove the subprime mortgage crisis, was that a bunch of people were taking out variable interest rate loans. And then when the loan came due, or like when the variable interest rate changed and they started getting hit with these really high the monthly payments, they all defaulted. Um, and we're having the same kind of problem now. It's like now the debt payments have gone up. They keep trying to refinance this to kick the can down the road, but that's just going to add money to our monthly payments, basically. Um, and and so it's a tough thing. It's a tough pill to swallow for regular people who had no say in that in the first place and derived no benefit from it, to see um, that their schools are crumbling, their roads are crumbling. They can't afford to fix their house because the property taxes are so high. Maybe they're getting pushed out of the neighborhood because the property taxes are so high. And then the money that property, those property taxes are going to, primary, or at least 40% of it, nearly half of it, is going to, you know, somebody's shit from 30 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Um, and
God,
so
that's so
I think that's
annoying.
really fucked up. Yeah, and it's a
We
problem
just
not just
keep
for us.
transferring debt to the next generation, like in every way, like socially, paying for the sins of our fathers. I feel like I think about that a lot when it comes to like the fact that we haven't had reparations for Black Americans. Like we're gonna keep like taking on, like we keep trying to push things off to the next generation instead of being like, no, we have to own all of the things that have happened before us before we can possibly move forward. And so that's why I feel very stuck in politics right now, personally.
Hmm.
You know.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. And there's some interesting writing and thinking on like the gerontocracy now. Um,
Mhm.
and I think part of it is because we have such a youth obsessed culture. It's just like we fetishize youth, but we give all the power to the elderly. Um, and it creates these extremely weird dynamics in society where it's like the I mean, you look at voter participation rates and it just like goes up. It's like it's almost a straight line up until like people stop being able to get out of the house, and then it kind of drops off. Um, and and so not only do they have more money than everybody, and they have houses and they have stability and they have all that, but they also have more free time. And then they're all voting. But like a lot of folks are like, well, why should I pay for public schools? It's like, motherfucker, what do
Mhm.
you mean? Why should you pay for public
The
schools?
ones
Because
that you
are you
came
not?
up in, like
Yeah, well, like, well, I don't have the kids
the
in the
one
public
your
schools
grand,
anymore.
you like, oh my God,
And then they're like,
no.
oh, the youth gangs, like all those kids on the streets are so scary. It's like maybe they wouldn't be scary if you hung out at the park sometimes and saw that kids are just kids. But if you just see
Yeah.
kids on TV, like, yeah, of course you're going to be feel scared and nervous about a changing world. You have to continue to participate in it. And this is part of the problem. I mean, particularly like suburbia and like even the bungalow belt, or like places that create seclusion and create barriers between people and like the broader community. And like we were talking about a few weeks ago, it's like I don't think that you can have a pro people policy if it's not intergenerational. And
Mhm.
you've got to bring, our community elders in to play a role with the youth. And and we should have kind of a community that will still kind of support each other like that. And then that would solve a lot of things where like, you know, the the problems that the elderly face is like they're because their kids are so busy and have no
Mhm.
support, they're dying alone, and that's horrible.
Mhm.
And they're having to go to old people's homes, and like and they're dying penniless too because they pay all their money to these old people's homes, and so there is no generational transfer of wealth. And so, and once again, like everything actually goes up to the billionaire class, right? Who own, who've rolled up all of these long-term care facilities into like VCs and into whatever else. Um, and so whatever, it all becomes part of the same story. But I do think that that's a, like I said, I I understand why it happened. I understand how it happened. I don't know what to do about it now. And I don't think that, I certainly don't think that like massive public austerity is the solution. And I always think about it too in terms of like Latin American debt, right? So you'll have these regimes like Argentina and Chile and to an extent Mexico, but more of these other places where US imperialism was able to actually like install a dictator. Um, and then that dictator ran up a shitload of debt to pay like all these American connected cronies, right? And everyone gets rich and they take off and they all live in Miami or New York or something. And then now 30 years later, we're imposing austerity through the IMF because we said that they were irresponsible in the 80s, but they were actually taken over by somebody else who like it's like somebody stealing your credit card, running up $1 million on it, and then the Fed's coming and saying, hey, like moralizing, not just punishing you, not just like taking your house, but actually saying, we're taking your house because you are irresponsible and you deserve to lose your house. And that's kind of how it feels here in Chicago, which is like we were the victims of a captive political system that we have been, many of us, fighting for generations. And now we are being told that like, well, we all have to bear the brunt of this collectively, when, you know, there were a lot of sweetheart deals for corporations. We just talked about TIFs for Target. You know, there were a lot of, you know, a lot of special interest groups that got their payday and got theirs. And now, once again, we're privatizing expenses and socializing profits, right? Sorry, privatizing profits and socializing expenses. I had that backwards. But yeah, so I know we're like at the end of time, but I think it would be great maybe next time to talk about the history of labor in Chicago, because that's something that's also incredibly important and impactful to like the whole country and the whole world. In fact, something also I'm particularly proud of as a Chicagoan, and also the impact of the why we shifted to a nonpartisan election system in Chicago for racist reasons, and kind of what the impact of that is now, and kind of how I think thinking about it in the way that we were forced to in Chicago because of the nonpartisan races is, I think, useful for understanding what's happening broadly nationally in terms of the shift in the electorate.
Yeah, no, it all seems important too with upcoming races and alderman races, and yeah, just understanding how that all works and like how we can work against the way it was designed to work if it's not working for us. So yeah, sounds good for next week. Thanks for coming by, y'all. Thank you, Andrew, and we'll see everyone next week.
Life. I saw a man, he danced with his wife in Chicago, Chicago, my hometown.